My guest today is Alex Tarascio. He's an international pollster and Republican strategist whose job it is to understand what people are thinking here in the US and across the globe. His information helps form the foundation for how politicians and causes pick their issues, find their message, and target voters. In this conversation, we talk about the challenges of conducting accurate polls, how political realignment is creating new fault lines, and how Americans and the rest of the world are reacting to a second Trump term. Alex, welcome to the World and Stuff podcast. So happy that you could join us and giving us some time here. Just wanted to start a little bit about your background. You went to the University of Oregon, studied political science. I, too, was a political science major at the University of Central Florida, so we have that in common. You're a little bit younger than me, I take it. So your time period in college was like 2007 to 2011. So it strikes me, this is financial collapse, bailouts, Great Recession, rise of Obama, Tea Party backlash. Was that formative to your political outlook and kind of where you went with your career?
So I'd say Tea Party backlash, absolutely. With respect to the financial crisis, I felt pretty lucky at the time because I was like a freshman, sophomore when it really hit. I remember I had a professor that said, taught me a Chinese proverb that I've since heard many times, which is, may you live in interesting times. And we did at that point. But I felt lucky because the people I knew that were graduating at that point, they were having a really hard time finding jobs. And that was a formative experience for a lot of people in my generation. But I got to ride out those first few years in college. I went into politics ultimately. And, there are no recessions in politics. People have to get reelected, elected. And so there's always some money in there. And at that point in time, when I really got engaged in 2010 is when there started to be a lot more money. And a lot of the initial work that I did in the political sphere during and then after college was PAC work, political action committee, that would have been much reduced or impossible without the Citizens United ruling. So my wife worked for a lot of political campaigns. And so we often will debate back and forth about our different perspectives in politics. Her working for the more traditional, like I'll call it like a brick and mortar campaign, even though there's no bricks and no mortar. Whereas I worked for the, at that point, Wild West of political action committees doing interesting kinds of work with a huge flow of new money.
Yeah, politics a little bit like journalism insofar as it is a little bit recession proof. I think journalism is a little bit more susceptible to the ebbs and flows of advertising dollars, but people are still going to want to know what's going on even during recession. You talked about the Tea Party movement being formative. That was kind of one of my first experiences in journalism. I remember covering like kind of the Tea Party movement and rallies. What about that drew you in?
I think I got involved right after the Scott Brown election. And at that point, the healthcare law was like the focal point of American politics. And I took some time off of school because I couldn't figure out a way to make a political campaign fit with an internship. And so I took some time off in my third year and worked for one campaign as a volunteer. My uncle, it was a state senator in California who had retired, and his kids despised politics because it meant that their dad was away in Sacramento for 4 days a week, every single week that they were growing up. And so when I called him and asked if he had any friends who need people that could volunteer for him, because I had no marketable skills that I could think of. I was, 20-something-year-old. I just had interest, and that was it, and legs and a smile. And he said, absolutely, because I didn't know it at that point, but politics really does run on volunteers. And so I volunteered for one campaign, and then another one came along, and they offered to pay me $500 a month, which I said, great, that sounds excellent to me. And then after that, I got hired for a much larger campaign, giving me like a proper salary, which was, more money than I knew what to do with at like 2021. And that ended in the 2010 cycle. And then I went back to school after that. And, I felt like a changed man or a young man. And so it was a huge event, huge year. And then I eventually went back to work after I graduated for the same firm that had employed me for what I call that real job at the end.
You talked about how Citizens United changed things and allowed more money to flow in politics. Explain to our viewers what you mean by that and how it impacted your trajectory.
I didn't know it at the time, but the RNC and the NRCC, the NRSC, the Republican Party controls a lot less of the total amount of resources that go into politics and paying for the ads that you see on TV or online, or that pay for the mailers that come to your mailbox. And, in the old days, the Republican Party controlled a lot of that. Since Citizens United, it unleashed private organizations, unions, any organization that a group of people might want to form to pursue an issue. Kind of what we think of now as just regular politics, because they've permeated the whole space. And it allowed all these non-party figures to come in and spend money to communicate with people, to get their message out. That was either it didn't exist or it was far reduced before Citizens United. And so that was really a pivotal point in changing the dynamic between the political party and everybody else who wants to get involved in politics. And so now there are many, many more independent groups involved. For me as a consultant, that makes things interesting, but also harder. And so I think on balance, it's a good thing for me, but it does mean that the party is weaker.
So you bounced around to some kind of maybe through some more traditional Republican candidates, Mitt Romney, Scott Walker. You worked for Kevin McCarthy for a little bit, but you end up at the International Republican Institute. What is IRI and what did you do there?
So IRI is one of 4 institutes that constitute what Ronald Reagan in the 80s, he created it, what he called the 4 pillars of democracy around the world. And so the National Endowment for Democracy funded, I think it was 1983, 4 organizations for those 4 pillars. 2-party system, so IRI is the International Republican Institute. The National Democratic Institute, so you have to have a 2-party system for a democracy to function. You can't just have one party. We're not China. The Solidarity Center, which was the pillar for organized labor. And then the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE. So private sector, organized labor, 2-party system. That was the foundation of the National Endowment for Democracy, and some number of millions of dollars a year from the 80s until now, it still exists, went toward funding these in helping out emerging democracies all around the world. And the beginning of this was really in Poland with the Solidarity movement. And the idea for American policymakers then and really now still is that we had all these countries where the Berlin Wall had come down, where they had been communist, and now they were emerging democracies. But who is going to be organized enough in those countries to be able to push back against the communists? Because if nobody can organize, then the only people who know how to be a political party and put together volunteers and get people out to vote are the communists. The US didn't want that. And so we, in the 80s and now, funded these movements through organizations like mine. And I don't mean funded like gave them money. We would train people how to organize. We would train people how to run, how to create a platform, how to use polling, how to use data, how to talk to voters, how to get how to recruit candidates, how to get people out in a room full of people that hate them and then pick themselves up and go do it again. Because it's kind of a thankless task. We think of politicians as, a lot of negative associated with it, but it's really hard to run for office. It's difficult on your family. It's difficult on your own life. And, it's a lot easier to do many other kinds of jobs and probably make more money and get more respect. And so IRI, a lot of what I would do is help parties learn how to push people and train them to get out of their comfort zone so that we could get more people to run for office, because ultimately that makes a healthier democracy. The work that I did was a little bit different. That's the formative years of like how it was founded. I did work in the Middle East. I did work on IRI's Iran program, which was all offshore, all closed, because if people were known to the Iranian government to be working with the Americans, then that would bring harm to them. And so they knew a little bit less than the kinds of people that I worked with in Pakistan. I trained a lot of women how to run campaigns and run for office. I worked in Turkey for a while, but I spent most of my time in Europe in doing work in the transatlantic space. And so Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and the institutions that bind Europe to the United States and what I call the Transatlantic Alliance. And so a lot of my work for the last 5 years or so that I worked there was running programs funded by the State Department or USAID in some cases, National Endowment for Democracy, to train parties, to train activists, to push parties to do different things. I did some issue work. I worked a lot on disinformation, a lot on organizing women, organizing young people, all to get engaged in the political system.
I always talk about this refrain that I have, people get tired of politics or annoyed by it. And I always think to myself, the way what we used to do before we had politics, we just killed each other or dominated each other. So it was interesting to me when you talked about how you would teach people to fight it out, be willing to accept the winners and the losers, pick it up and start back over again, and how kind of different that is from all of human history.
Yeah, I mean, it's a heck of an experiment. This is a better way of doing things. Is it dissatisfying to people? Absolutely, but the alternative is a lot worse, and this is still the best one that we have. And the barrier to entry for a political party is really low. Parties want bodies because every vote counts equally, and so you matter to the political party because you are a person. And I think that's inherently something that reflects human dignity. And so even though parties are usually the least popular political institution in every single country, when you compare them to the police or the military or firefighters or whatnot, they are still a fundamental, healthy component to a healthy democracy. You want people engaged and involved in political parties.
How do you look back at your work at IRI, considering, obviously there was a lot of, I think, what you would see as progress after the fall of the Soviet Union and democracy in Europe and other parts of the world. Do you see over the last, decade that there's been backsliding? Are those concerning developments for you?
A lot of experts point to backsliding. There's independent metrics that people use to define what that is. I think there's some truth to that. I also have spent enough time inside nonprofits. I spent about a decade working for a nonprofit, and IRI, even though it says Republican Institute, it's still based in Washington, D.C., and it's still comprised of people who are in a city that votes 94, 95% for the Democratic Party. And so I've been in the political minority for the entire time that I've lived in this region. And who defines what backsliding is very much reflective of the kinds of people who care about those issues, who are educated at institutions that churn out a certain kind of political affiliation in their graduates, and live in a city that is really dominated for one political perspective. And that's not just Washington, D.C. When you go to Berlin, when you go to London, when you go to Vienna, when you go to any of these other urban centers, the kinds of people that I worked with, they spoke English as a second language. They're highly educated, and they're going to be a little bit more progressive according to, whatever that meant for their local context. And so I try and have some humility when I talk about backsliding, because I've met with a lot of Hungarians who support Viktor Orban that are proud of their democracy. I had a woman scream in my face, actually, when I did an election observation in Budapest in 2022. And she took offense to the fact that these Western countries were calling her political party and her agenda that she cared about as, illegitimate, just because they won enough to be able to change the Constitution. We still call that a country that has backslid on many different metrics, but I try and take a step back and have a little bit of humility when I think about that, because that applies to many more countries than you might think. In Southeast Asia, in many countries in Africa, that what they call democracy, they worked hard for it and they're proud of it. And if it doesn't fulfill all the standards that we would like it to fulfill here in the West, standards that were defined and devised by people that generally had one political persuasion, that doesn't make it less of a democracy. And I know that's not quite what your question was, but that's what I think about whenever I think about democratic backsliding.
What do you make of the dismantling of USAID, because that has affected IRI? I don't know how much activity is going on at IRI right now. I know that a lot of people were furloughed. It's interesting to me because on the board of directors were all these major Republican figures, but still it seems like the agency wasn't spared the cuts that USAID saw in general. What do you think the impact of, I guess maybe you should tell me what's going on at IRI right now and what's the impact of that?
So you had the first part of it right. IRI had and still has, I think, several U.S. senators on the board of directors that are Republicans. Marco Rubio had been on the board, but since he's now Secretary of State, he stepped down. Joni Ernst, I think, is still on the board. Mitt Romney was on the board. I think that he still is. Tom Cotton, Dan Sullivan is the chair, and Lindsey Graham as well. So 6 Republican senators, you would think, and I think that I don't want to put words in the IRA leadership's mouth, but I think it was probably a pretty good bet that going into the new Trump administration, they would think that, they'd be in an okay spot. If one of their board members is going to be Secretary of State, they shouldn't have anything to worry about, right? Well, that didn't turn out to be right. The funding streams for IRI and for almost every nonprofit who accepted USG money from the US government was shut off. And that funding, that mechanism, as soon as I read that executive order that came out on January 20th, it was designed by people who had gone through government shutdowns and knew very, very well what the vulnerable points were, because most NGOs are not equipped to float 90 days, much less than that. When IRI had gone through government shutdowns when I had worked there, the longest shutdown to date, the 35 days, it meant they needed to go get a loan. They needed to go through extraordinary measures to be able to pay the staff because they can only hold on to a couple of weeks of cash flow. Because the government doesn't just give you a bunch of money if you win a grant. They give you enough of what they think you need to go through a set period of time. And so you have to prove that you've spent that money in order to draw down more. That's how nonprofits work. And so the people who designed that executive order, they knew that. And they knew that after 90 days, which I think it should be about up by now, maybe the 20th or the 22nd or something, that would lead to most NGOs having severe cash flow issues. And I think probably half, maybe 2/3 going under, because they would not be able to afford that money being cut off. And so IRI was not spared. It shut down its website. It furloughed most of its staff. They've gotten a little bit back from the National Endowment for Democracy, which managed to get a very small drawdown. But it's on life support right now. And a huge number of my friends and former colleagues, they've either been laid off, or a handful of them have been called back to essentially shut down programs. And, that's from an organization that spent $100+ million a year. So it's not a small entity. And that'll affect, many more organizations too, beyond just IRI.
What do you think that says about the worldview of the Trump administration? I mean, is this them basically saying that soft power and democracy building is a waste of time and we should just kind of exploit our advantages and others' weaknesses?
There's some of that. I think it's a little bit, I think the prominent motive was different though. I don't think it's that the Trump administration doesn't value this kind of work or that they don't think soft power is important. Although if you push them on it, they may very well say that. There will come a crisis somewhere around the world where there's some government, say what happened in Venezuela in 2019, 2020, when Maduro steals an election and there's an opposition figure that probably wins, and the U.S. wants to see a democratic transition in that country. There's a ton of utility for the United States to be able to support those opposition figures, because the country is not better off with more authoritarian governments around the world. They're unstable. They change their alliances really fast. And in general, the U.S. is better off with more democratic allies. So there will come a time when this Trump administration encounters some situation somewhere in the world where they want to exert soft power, and they'll relearn this lesson that they had learned in the first term. But beyond that, I think the main driving force behind why they picked the foreign aid sector as one of the first targets of really trying to dismantle it is that it is made up of people, like I said earlier, because I had a lot of time to think about this, where it's almost entirely people aligned on the left who the Trump administration and Trump-aligned people regard, maybe appropriately, as their political enemies. These are people who went out of the streets to protest against him. These are people who at times used their position to undermine the Trump administration. And there's just very, very few Republican voters in that sector. And so if you want to pick a part of the federal government to target and dismantle where you'll have very little collateral damage, it's a pretty good target because there's a lot of resistance in there. So that's one reason. What I saw in my time there was people who didn't think of themselves as political, but the practical effect of the work that they did and the biases that they had was extremely political. I wrote proposals. I wrote hundreds of proposals when I was at IRI applying for grants. And for the last couple of years that I was there, every time I wrote a proposal to the State Department, I had to complete a gender inclusion annex. Now that sounds anodyne, right? But a gender inclusion annex meant that you had to talk about how your program was going to help trans people, how you were going to help women in the program, how you were going to help young people in the program, and like what sort of diversity you were going to have. That became enshrined as a nonpartisan value, because it is a nonpartisan value. In application, it meant that the only kinds of organizations that you're able to help are organizations that believe in, a worldview that there are more than two genders. That's going to exclude conservative organizations in country. I've met a lot of African political leaders and political experts who really resent that. And they resent the way the US used these like nonpartisan labels and standards to set the agenda in their countries. And so the Trump administration in its second term, they have a lot of people who experienced this and went through this. And these agendas are being pushed by like career bureaucrats, career civil servants, not political appointees. And so if you have a government, a bureaucracy that has ostensibly non-political people that are enshrining extremely political agendas, and I just gave one example, but there's a couple dozen others I could given the time, then it does no damage to eliminate those bureaucracies if your goal is to try and root out people who are going to oppose your political agenda, if that's the goal. And so I do think that was the goal. I think they picked it because there's no domestic constituency in the US that is going to raise a fuss about foreign aid getting disrupted in the same way that there would be if you tried to shut down like the Small Business Administration. There's people in the US who are entitled to those things and they'll fight hard to protect them. In the foreign aid sector, that protection wasn't going to happen. So they were vulnerable and they were a good target. And so I think that's really why they targeted it.
But it seems like you have the perspective that the Trump administration might believe that there are no consequences to ending programs that benefited from USAID, but eventually they're going to learn the hard way that this it's not just like this constituency of people that work there that maybe have different worldviews from them, but the work that these organizations did in country, these projects in the background of all of that, and the reason why that they were established in the first place is because in the long run, it is important to U.S. foreign policy and the health of the American economy and all these different things.
I fully agree with that. And I do think that it is a bad thing for the country to cut off so abruptly a lot of these ties, a lot of these relationships. I don't think it'll happen immediately. Just because these programs end, the relationships are not so fragile that they're tied to a grant here and a grant there. And if they are, then it's probably worth losing some of those. But there's a lot of people that worked for IRI, and they are in countries where now that the U.S. has withdrawn its financial interest in aid programs, they could be under some threat. And so those people are now going to be thinking twice about, the exposure that they put themselves under by working for an American organization promoting a goal of a democratic society that may conflict with the government's. And so that's something that I am concerned about, is that those are good allies of the country. And when we want something in the future, those people are going to think twice. And they probably should think twice about how long-term it is that the U.S.'s engagement will last. And unfortunately, this isn't the only example of it. I'm a patriot. I love this country. But some of the most shameful moments, I think, are those times that we've walked away from our friends around the world in ways that have really hurt them. Walking away from the Kurds, that's a hard choice that we did in the first Trump administration. I get it, because I was friends with Turks who said, "Hey, we're your ally. We're your NATO ally. And so are you going to pick these Kurds who we regard as terrorists, or are you going to pick us?" There was no world in which the U.S. would side against Turkey, but still, we fought with these people against ISIS in Syria, and to walk away from them and let the Turks, fight against them is something that left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. That's kind of what this reminds me of, on a smaller scale, less dangerous scale, but that's not a bright day in America to look back to and be proud of.
How would you expect this disengagement to end up impacting the United States? Is it like kind of like 1,000 pinpricks that eventually will open up a gaping wound? You talked about people just being kind of less willing to work with us. And does that over time kind of build up and lead to blind spots and the ability for other major powers to work their way in and capitalize?
So it's a really good question. My work dealt with individuals. And think about the U.S. foreign aid budget. It's 40 some odd $billion, and the programs that I worked on were, they totaled millions in a given year, but those programs would work with a set number of people who are change makers in that society. And we give these people an opportunity to learn something. Maybe they run for office when they wouldn't have otherwise. I spent a lot of time actually trying to track the behavior change. Like, what is the result of the intervention that we just did? Did we actually change something? And in every program, that you don't change things. Like, sometimes you do. If you have a really well-designed program, a well-designed intervention, then you fulfill a need that exists. But it's not a market need. There's not a private sector. You're creating something new. And so there are lots of programs that were a waste of money. Lots of programs that either responded to a need that wasn't really there, or they missed the mark and they just didn't succeed. Maybe it's as simple as like losing the right person who had all the connections on the ground, and then you hire somebody else who just doesn't know anyone, and you squander money for a year. So there's a lot of things the U.S. government did that will have very little impact for having lost them. There's other cases where maybe 10 years of engagement was long enough in a country, but we didn't need to be there for 20 years because 10 years, it hit that level of democracy that we wanted. And there's still a good reason to engage for another 10 years. But is it going to make a difference that that country's not going to be a democracy anymore? Probably not. And so I think about the small scale impact, the aggregate impact of 1,000 of those little cuts. Is it going to leave a gaping wound? Maybe in some places. I don't think in a huge number of them. But yeah, in some cases, there will be things that didn't happen, positive changes that the U.S. would have liked to see that don't happen. There will be people who would have maybe taken a risk with a little bit of help and a little bit of support to help their communities out, who decide not to do that. And, beyond that, it's hard to predict what effect that has. Some of those effects will probably be positive because it's a market distorting impact of us being there in a lot of different sectors, in health and food. And so the local people will fill those gaps in some cases. At least that's what I hear when I talk to African political consultants, is that they are looking forward to being able to fill the gaps. I hope so. I hope they can. But in other cases, I think it'll be like a really obvious harm.
Wanted to ask you about moving to Signal, and maybe tell me a little bit about what Signal is and why this knowledge that you're gaining is so important.
So it was an easy switch for me to go from supporting emerging democracies around the world and, small d Democrats and activists. I used a ton of polling in the work that I did because, public opinion is the ultimate currency. Right and wrong is one thing, but if the people want something, that is another. That sometimes is consistent with what people think of as right and wrong, and sometimes it's not, but it matters all the same. So public opinion, something that I was familiar with. I spent a lot of time thinking about questions and ways in which public opinion was relevant to my work. So now I work at Signal. Signal is a private GOP pollster. And so that means that we are not a public pollster. We're not like YouGov or Morning Consult or like the polls that you see published, every month or every couple of weeks leading up to a big election. We're private. 98, 99% of all the surveys that we do never go public. We are polling for mostly political parties and campaigns and candidates on the right. That makes us a GOP pollster. There's not very much crossover in Republican versus Democratic pollsters. My team has its pollsters. The other team has their pollsters. There's a handful of people that switch hit, but really not very many, which is not unique around the world, but it's less common. Most other places I work, pollsters are not completely aligned with one political party, although it's obvious to me why we do it this way here. So just one of those funny differences of working around the world. So private GOP pollster, the polls that I do they look a lot different than the public polls that you're probably familiar with and that most people have seen, where it's a horse race poll showing, is Donald Trump up or down? Is Joe Biden up or down? What's the gap between the two? How does that differ per state? There's really a couple of questions. Those are top lines, and those are horse race numbers. That's fine. That's useful. That's important. But the polls that I do are less about where the public is at and more about how the people I'm working with, say it's a campaign, how they can move the public to where they want them to go. And so I test a lot of persuasion because my clients, I want them to be able to act. And so one of our taglines is intelligence for action. And that means they get intelligence, political intelligence, for the purpose of changing their behavior somehow, making a decision, deciding where they're going to allocate campaign resources in the last week of a campaign. Which of 10 messages are you going to decide on for your campaign? You don't get to pick 10. People will not pay attention to 10. They'll pay attention to a max of 3, but really 1 or 2. And so what are the 1 or 2 most compelling messages, and for which populations? Is there a limit? Are people already convinced? Do they already believe message A? And so you should just skip that and move on to message B. Like, those are very specific questions. And you can test that when you ask a lot about who people are, where they're at now, so that you can assess momentum. And the way that we're able to do that is by having a lot of really brilliant data scientists and statisticians that work for us in-house, which is a little unusual compared to most pollsters. And we design and incorporate a lot of really interesting, fascinating math in determining like how something can be persuasive and what something means when we triangulate against another answer.
We always hear from pollsters about how difficult it is to get people's opinions anymore. People use cell phones, are reluctant to share this type of information. How big of a struggle is that for you, and what type of how do you account for that? And yeah,
it's not as big of a struggle as you might think compared to what I would hear prior to going into this business. It's a problem that a lot of pollsters still have, but the reason that I picked this one and that I'm working at this company and not some other company, one of the big ones is that Signal embraces new methods of polling people. There's a debate in the pollster community about a couple different things. So if you just need to make phone calls, if that's the gold standard and the only way really that you should try and contact people, that is the method that we used to use in the country. Or can you use online polling? Most pollsters now are using online polling, but not all. And there's some orthodox people out there that think that the gold standard has been that you open up a phone book and you just call people randomly, and that makes for a probabilistic survey. But people don't have landlines, as you said. People have cell phones, and so they're not going to be in the phone book. I haven't had a phone book in more than a decade, probably 2. And so that method is not suitable anymore. And so you can get around it by calling a lot more people, so that you can call 25,000 people to field a 1,000-person sample. That's one way to get around it. Or you can access multiple modes of contacting people, which is what we do at Signal. And so we do a combination of live phone calls. We do SMS or text that has a link to getting people to take an online survey. That phone element's important. Or you can get an email that will invite you to participate in a poll, and then that's not SMS to online, that's just email to online. And when you have the phone involved in some way, even if it's not a phone call, but if you have somebody's phone number, then we can verify that that person is a real person in the voter file. That's something that, for the most part, only exists in the United States. And they're private companies that acquire data about voters from registrars of voters all over the country, because every county registrar will sell that data to voter files. And then organizations like mine or campaigns, they will lease that data, get access to it, pay a fee, and then use that to either call people like I do and get a hold of people and find out who they are, or you can send them mailers and campaign literature and whatnot. That has made targeting voters much, much more accurate, because we know our sample of who we're working with. And so even though when I call or when I sample voters, the most likely person who's going to answer the phone is a retired older woman who is fairly wealthy and likely college educated. And if you don't wait at all and you just deal with the people that come in, randomly essentially, then you're going to be overrepresented in that category. And so what pollsters will do, including me, is that we will make sure that we're contacting other people, younger people who are harder to get a hold of, people of color who are harder to get a hold of, less educated people who are harder to get a hold of. And if you can't find enough of them, then you need to weight them higher. So you need to like double or triple the value of every single Black, conservative, non-college educated respondent that you find, because that person's harder to find, for instance. Signal, we don't like to do a lot of weighting. We don't want to magnify what could be errors, because that single non-college educated Black conservative They might have some outlier views in some other ways. They might believe in a bunch of conspiracies. And so if you magnify the value of that one person, then you're magnifying whatever other error you're introducing into your survey. And ultimately that means you might be wrong in the overall numbers. And so we get around that by building models of who we think the electorate is going to be. And then we reach out to typically more people than we need to. So if we have 1,000-person sample, we might survey 1,400 people to completion so that we can figure out which 1,400 people will constitute a sample that is exactly what we think is representative of the electorate.
Why do polls keep underestimating Donald Trump?
It's a great question. I think, and this is a theory, I say I think because I don't know, but my theory is that Donald Trump brings on in his coalition most or a higher number of the lower trust people in society. I say low trust in that I answer every poll that people reach out to me with because I know them, I use them, and I kind of want to do my part in making them work. But I'm a weird person. I'm a pollster. And even before, I was still a weird person. I'm not a good representative sample of that. And every time I answer a poll, it's always at an inconvenient time. It's at like dinner time and I need to feed my daughter. My wife looks at me and she's like, really? Like, you're really doing a poll right now? It's going to take you 20 minutes and we're right in the middle of dinner. It's inconvenient. And so the people who don't trust pollsters, who are not like me, who think, actually, I think that these pollsters are all scam artists and that this is a waste of time, they also are inconvenienced in the same way that I am. And so they're just not going to participate. They have a lot of other barriers. Also, spam calls are a thing. Spam emails are a thing. And so they're not going to try more to participate in a poll. The people that are going to be more educated, higher trust, people that interface with society all the time. They know how society works. They know how investment works. They know how insurance works. People who are less educated, who are lower trust in a lot of different dimensions, they are less likely to take a poll. It used to be that those people were distributed pretty evenly across the two parties. Donald Trump has more of those people in his coalition than has been true before. And so by a factor of a couple of percentage points, it's not huge, but maybe 3-4 percentage points, that has led to an error in every election where Donald Trump has been on the ballot, 3 of them. And so it hasn't been a factor when he's been off the ballot. Polls have been pretty darn accurate when he's off the ballot, but with him uniquely, things have been wrong, and I think it's because of this convergence of lower trust individuals. That's my theory. A lot of other people have other theories, but that's mine. I don't buy the shy Trump voter theory. I think that has mostly had its day. That might have been true in the first election, but it wasn't true in this election. People were not shy about supporting Donald Trump.
So you have all this great information about what people are thinking in the United States and around the world, and I want to mine that to have some what I think could be interesting conversations here. Let's start at home and kind of how people are reacting to the first, I guess, almost 100 days of the Trump administration. When I talk to my liberal friends, it's like the sky is falling. Things could not be worse. And of course, people are starting to see how terrible Trump is now, and Republicans are going to, see the light and switch sides. When I talk to my conservative friends, it's like, what are you talking about? Everything's great. So I just wonder, what are you seeing in the polls about how Americans are reacting to the second Trump administration so far?
I've seen less movement than you might expect if you were just consuming media from mainstream media, from television sources, and even from Twitter, frankly. The last poll that we did, of a public poll, we do one a month. Even though 99% of our polls are private, we do a public poll for a ton of reasons, but we like to get our name out there. It's a good marketing exercise, and we like to ask questions that we can talk about the answers to them. And so our last public poll, it was fielded April 1st to 3rd. April 2nd was Liberation Day for the Trump administration. Excuse me. That was when the tariffs came into effect. The next day, the market crashed in earnest. And then the following week, and even now still to today, there's been a huge amount of market volatility. And so we conducted our poll right at the beginning of that. And it's a great example of polls being a snapshot in time. So even though some of this volatility was actively happening, it takes a few days for public events to bake into the public consciousness. And so had we been able to do that poll a week later, I'm curious about what the results would have been differently, because in our data, we saw a through line where Trump's approval rating was unchanged from March to April. And from February to March, there was really very little change at all. He is still more popular today in our polling than he was on election day. And he has been underwater in his approval basically the whole time that he's been in politics. And that's fairly unique to him. It's not completely, but fairly. He's comfortable being unpopular in a way that most politicians, they change their behavior when they're unpopular. And so that hasn't changed too much. I wonder, if we had done that poll a week later, I think maybe he would have been a point or two down, but not a lot more than that. And that's a little bit of a surprise. I think the reason why his approval rating has been so steady, the dynamic you identify is right. Your liberal friends are going to say the sky is falling. The media says the sky is falling, but it's not just, cope on the conservative side either. There is quite a bit of data that shows that his approval rating has stayed pretty steady. I think in the economic dimension, that's because most people, the masses, they don't own a lot of stocks. And so they're not really affected by the market. There's some people that are even kind of enthusiastic about the prospect of housing prices going down, which is a really weird way to have people talk about the market. Like 10 years ago, I don't think people would have celebrated the market going down, even if they weren't invested in it. And so that
or the dollar losing its value.
Right. Like there's the dollar being strong or weak has positive and negative effects. Like more foreigners are going to invest in the United States when the dollar is weaker because their money goes a lot farther. And that's less true when the dollar is strong. But there's winners and losers on either side of the equation, right? If I want to travel and spend my money abroad, then I'm a loser. And so my money will not go nearly as far by doing that. But I can get more people to spend money here. So yeah, like that should hurt. But I don't see Americans expressing views that they think that hurts them. And so the tariff result has been interesting. I'm seeing something similar in immigration where Trump's approval, when you ask people, which party do you approve of handling on immigration, economy, inflation, whatever, Trump is still like 15, 20 points up. Republicans, I should say, 15, 20 points up on their handling of immigration, even while it's in the news constantly. And there's a lot of stories about due process and the administration's getting a lot of criticism on these things. The thing that's changed compared to the first Trump administration is, and I want to explore this in subsequent public polls. We're going to do one in May. And I was just talking to a colleague about how we can tease out this difference, is that people are much more willing now, even like a third of Democrats and sometimes more, to take a harder line in deporting people, like no matter what, on immigration. I think that people feel the system is not serving them well on a variety of issues. On immigration, certainly. On tariffs, I don't know that people have a great understanding of what tariffs are in the first place. I'm certain people don't have a good understanding of what trade deficits are in the first place. And so if Trump says he wants to reduce the trade deficit, I don't know that most people have a good foundation on which to say that's a bad thing. The experts do, but people have a lot less trust in experts than they used to. And if they're not bothered by the market going down, then that helps me understand why public opinion has been stickier on some of these different dimensions. But, we'll see what happens in our May poll. We'll start feeling it in 2 weeks or so, maybe a little bit less. Do people finally have their views change on illegal immigration? Are there certain classes of immigrants that people just really don't want to see prioritized in deportation, and then others that they do? Probably, but I don't have that data, and so that's kind of the magic of my position, is I get to ask questions where I have a hypothesis, but I don't actually know the answer. If there's something you want to know the answer to, then I love a good hypothesis if you want to share it.
I don't have a hypothesis, but I was wondering, like, if I was Donald Trump and I came to you and said, hey, Alex, what is it? Where am I vulnerable? Where do I need to be careful? Where could I actually lose support? Because you're telling me that it doesn't seem, at least so far, that it's the stock market or immigration being, called, not giving people due process in the immigration. So that kind of stuff is going around. So where is Trump's vulnerability?
He's vulnerable on going after close American allies. There's really not support for going after the Canadians, whether it's making them 51st state, whether it's tariffs on the Canadians. We did that we tested that in February. I don't think we tested the 51st state, but we tested tariffs, and there just wasn't support for it. There was pretty broad support for tariffing China. and there was narrow lack of support for tariffing Mexico. It was like maybe 47-53, something like that. But people did not support tariffs on Mexico, and people were not enthusiastic about taking Greenland. Americans are pretty loyal people, I think. Those views that I expressed earlier about like it being a shameful day when we abandoned our allies. I think that Americans generally feel that. They may not want to fight foreign wars, and I don't think they do, but that doesn't mean that we think that like our allies should be bullied. And I don't think that that's something that Americans understand a whole lot or support enthusiastically. I do think Americans are comfortable going after China on tariffs. I think that they have they'll give the administration wide latitude on that. And the EU, maybe. I think that one's probably pretty close to 50-50, but the EU is not a country. Nobody is from the EU. Nobody has ancestry that is from the European Union. They have ancestry from Italy or from Poland or a country. So I think the EU probably has a little bit more support. On immigration, when you ask people, do you want to deport all the illegal immigrants? Just almost super majority say yes, if you just kind of blanket in one category. If you focus on smaller categories of more sympathetic kinds of people, or you get people into the weeds and in the details about how, then people get a little uncomfortable with deporting certain classes that are more sympathetic. Criminals, easy. Turning people away at the border, easy. But folks that are on the more law-abiding side of the spectrum, Americans are not as enthusiastic about deporting those. And so the more time you're spending on that, on deporting sympathetic people, instead of talking about, frankly, the other 5 million unsympathetic folks, Americans are not entirely comfortable with that.
When people come to you internationally and ask you what's going on in the United States,
happens a lot.
What do you tell them?
I tell them that that's a big question. They need to make it smaller.
Okay. I'm Europe and I'm trying to understand what's going on in the United States, or I'm the UK trying to understand what's going on in the United States and how it applies to me. Does that help you answer the question, or maybe you can tell me how I can narrow it down?
No, I really do mean it. That's how I respond almost always. It depends on the kind of person and what their goal is. But for a lot of people from the UK, I'm a political pollster, so I work with other political people. And when I talk to UK conservatives, in the early days of the administration, there was like palpable jealousy from them because they just got shellacked, the worst defeat of a political party, I think, in its history. Labour has something like 580 seats, and conservatives are bleeding members to the Reform Party, and so they're in a fight now for the soul of the future of the party. And they had 14 years in power. People were dissatisfied with what they accomplished in that 14 years, and so the jealousy that I heard and really felt is because Trump comes in, he does all these executive orders, and he can just do things. And he doesn't have all this bureaucracy stopping him. He doesn't have all this civil service stopping him. And he can do something like Doge, and he can just do things. And in the UK system, that's not really how it's been set up. And they were very interested in trying to create something that would give the elected government a little bit more ability to influence what it can actually do. Because the bureaucracy can stop a lot of things in the UK system more than here. And so that's one very specific dimension where they were very favorable toward that idea. Because I think their voters punished them for not accomplishing as much as they wanted them to accomplish, despite getting voted in multiple times. When I talk to Canadians, it's a very different kind of conversation. Early on, they'd ask me, what's going on? What's the motivation behind this? And I would tell them truthfully, I don't know. I can read the executive orders and I see what it says about fentanyl over the border. But beyond that, I don't really understand the focus on going after them. I think that Donald Trump has more respect for the current Prime Minister Carney, just by the way he talks about him. I think he has more respect for Claudia Sheinbaum down at Mexico, who is maybe the most popular leader in Latin America today. She's got like mid-80s approval rating. And she has not caved to the United States, not by any means, but she has worked with the United States, and she's done it with kind of some dignity and gravitas, and kept her country's interest in mind without being really loud about it on television and railing against Trump all day. I think people like that, even though she's firmly on the left. She has support from conservative Mexican voters because she's looking out for her country, and so I think that's kind of the model. Other places in Latin America, depending on the kinds of people I'm talking to, If they're conservatives, and usually they are, then they want to emulate what success Trump has had and try and capitalize on certain kinds of changes in their own electorates. Because across the democratic world, there's a political realignment happening that, men are getting more either conservative or going to the right, like across the Anglosphere. This is less true in Latin America. At least I haven't seen the data that it's true. This is happening in South Korea. This is happening in Japan. This is happening in Australia, in the UK and New Zealand, that men are going to the right and women are going to the left in maybe equal measure, give or take some percentage points. So that dynamic is happening everywhere. In the US, we're seeing like tariffs used to be something the Democratic Party was more in favor of, and the Republican Party was a free trade party. That's changing. And that's changing in real time pretty rapidly as this political realignment happens. And that's not unique to here. And so when people ask me what's going on in the United States, I want to reflect it back on them and kind of compare that to some of the trends in their own countries, because this is not something that is just unique to the US. There's frustration with the system everywhere. People want their governments to accomplish what their governments were voted in to accomplish. And if the democracies can't deliver on that, then people will dispense with elements of democracy before they will dispense with what they want to see their government do. And that's kind of what I was trying to fight against when I was at IRI, because I was trying to defend democracies and convince people that democracy is the way to go if you want to accomplish things. But if people see that democracy just fails over and over and over again, this is something Ezra Klein wrote about in the Abundance book that came out recently. I think that there's something to that. And I'm happy that he's had this conversation start, because it's embarrassing when the United States can't build something as fast as like a French company can, or a Dutch company. Like, you can build a highway in Europe faster than almost anywhere in the United States. Why? Like, that's crazy. And so these political changes I see being a backlash to that, and just a collection of frustration with promises that were made to people by parties and by government, and people want to see a change.
Do you see the gender fault line being the most important way to look at politics across maybe at least the West, as opposed to, educational attainment has been one of the other fault lines that's been talked about a lot? Which one's more important? Do they intertwine? How do you look at that?
They definitely intertwine. Gender's probably more important right now. I think gender is a better predictor, better than age. Age is shifting. Education has been the predictor for a long time. And I think that might still be better depending on the country they're in and depending on the issue. But among Republicans, like non-college educated, but also highly educated Republicans, they often will vote on the same thing, and especially if they're men. And so the bigger divide that I see on a lot of different issues is gender. It does kind of depend on the issue. But like for the most part, I probably give the edge to gender.
How do you think that will play out over the next decade? Like, what impacts will that have on our politics if that trend continues, or even if it just kind of stays with this, like, I don't know, whatever 20-point gap between the genders?
That's probably the biggest unknown that I have in my mind today about what the ultimate impact is going to be. I've heard some smart people talk about how that could be a really dangerous phenomenon, like in maybe not the West, but in other parts of the world where like gender-based violence and really just gender-based violence is a factor. And so if politics starts to have parties just reflect one gender's view, then it's going to be easy to bleed over politics into other parts of life. And so like I kind of accept that there might be a threat on the horizon, at least in some parts of the world. But, mostly I just don't know. I know that it's going to have a big effect, but some of these things are really hard to predict. Like, and I'm going to come back to my humility point by making a comparison. When you're inside of an NGO, you want to cultivate your own expertise. And so you talk about predictions you might have. Predictions on AI, predictions on disinformation, predictions on any kind of new technology and what it's going to do. And I found that the predictions that experts that I worked with, like legitimate experts, that they would make were almost always wrong. And what actually happened was dictated by a million people out in the private sector and in their own lives coming up with interesting applications to video that instead of making a deep fake that imitates a politician, they come up with some fun way to create a music video faster. And like people amuse themselves and they make money. And those are more common motivators than some insidious motivator to like mess with democracy somehow. And so when I think about the gender divide and what it's going to do, it would be easy to come up with an insidious prediction and how it's going to be a bad thing. Those are all the obvious predictions. But I'm not positive about that. I want to have some humility and assume that it will change things, but in ways that are really hard to predict. And we should not necessarily assume that those are all going to be negative.
You were recently in the Middle East, and I found it interesting. You did some polling out there, and some of the findings I thought were super interesting. And one of them was that they're positive about their own future. They're positive about the future of the U.S. They like the U.S. They also like Russia, and they also like China. What did you make of what you found out there? Is it just like, sitting on trillions of dollars of oil wealth gives you a happy outlook on life, or what did you make of their opinions?
I think that you're half right on that last piece. They do have a happy outlook on life, and money has something to do with it. And it might be tied ultimately to the oil wealth, but some things to understand about that demographic. That the median age in that Middle East poll that we did is 30 years old. Extremely young population. Most countries that we were looking at have 66%, I think, aggregate expat population. And so these are not like, it was a poll of adults because these are not citizens who have the right to vote. These aren't democracies that we were polling in this poll. These are people who come there to work, and they're relatively young, and they are able to work and able to get ahead and build a future for themselves. And so that half right piece is that it does have to do with money. People are moving to this region because there's a ton of opportunity there. And it's also like 60-40 men, because people who are moving abroad are usually men, or they're weighted towards men. So it's kind of a weird population, at least compared to the United States. Money has a lot to do with it. Ability to get ahead has a lot to do with it. And their optimism for the future has a huge amount to do with it. And we asked people, in the next 5 years, do you think your economic opportunities are better by staying in your own country where you are now, or by moving abroad? And we asked people that in the Gulf, and we asked people that in the United States. And the figures were about the same for both regions. It was like 56%, 55% of people who said their economic opportunities are best by staying put where they are today. If I were to ask that question in different countries in Europe, Germany might say that they want to stay put, but there's kids, smart kids, that are leaving the UK in droves. If you ask this question in the Balkans, most people want to leave. Like, if you're educated, if you're smart, then you want to go to where you can make more money and to where you can get ahead. And if your own country is not the place for that, then those countries are getting hollowed out. And that brain drain does lead to brittle, unstable politics in a lot of these places where people are leaving. And I hate to see that happening to a place like the UK, but it is, when the average wage is just so much lower than what people could make in the US. And so I was encouraged to see that that's not a factor in the Gulf. It's not necessarily what I expected. But the US has a lot more in common with people in this region than I initially thought.
These countries that are experiencing brain drain and their people see the possibility of success happening more likely in other countries, do they want to come to the U.S.?
Totally. Usually. I mean, not 100% of the time, but that's the common destination.
That's pretty much the end of where I wanted to take all this. The last question I wanted to leave it on is just, with having so much expertise in public opinion and how people see politics, is there any perspective that you could give just on like what people might not understand about public perception?
Sure. Certain kinds of, it's really easy to get a result that I want to get, depending on the issue, because people, and their views are malleable. There's some views that are more malleable than others, and some that are very unmalleable. Like, partisan affiliation is one that's pretty unmalleable. Like abortion is another example that's not terribly malleable. People have a good idea about this already. They know about it. Tax cuts would be another one. And like, you can't convince them very easily. You can convince them a little bit. But when you do polling on like foreign aid or on issues that people don't know very much about, the trade deficit, it is extremely easy to ask a question in a way that you can be pretty sure what result you're going to get. And so a lot of my job as a pollster is to take out that bias to the greatest extent possible, to get at whatever the real version is of public opinion. But even when you get that, I can get you an answer that is neutral, but it might flip one direction or the other because those public perceptions are not very set. It's like wet concrete. It will be eventually if you keep on working on it. But if you were to walk through it, you're going to leave a bunch of footsteps behind. And so depending on the issue, those footsteps are where, my work really can shine if you want to create movement. But if you just want to know where something's at, the more granular, the more unknown, the more complex your topic, the data is just not going to be valuable. And so you could use this because if you look at a poll that is on a fairly complex issue that people may not know a ton about, and you have somebody that says very confidently, people believe X, you should be a little suspicious of that. Unless it's a really well-known, easy to understand issue, the reason you're seeing it is because somebody wants you to see it. And if it's a very niche topic, then people's views, that may be real, but they're not going to stay set like that, and they're easy to move. And so you should be a little distrustful when you see public opinion data that looks like it doesn't smell right to you. It probably doesn't smell right because it's rotten and because somebody is making money off of your perception of that result being a certain way.
Yeah, and people maybe are more able to be convinced if you come up with an effective and compelling argument than you might think. So
Totally.
We'll leave it at that. Alex, thanks so much for your time. I appreciated the conversation. Super interesting. Best of luck with everything you're working on.
Thanks a lot, Drew. I really enjoyed it.